Hi, how are you? I'm Robert Jones from Northern Illinois University. I'm a law professor, and some of my students were asking about how the bar exam is scored, how it's scaled, and I saw a lot of questions about it on Reddit as well. So I thought I would make a quick YouTube video explaining it to the best of my ability. And my hope is that it will put some people's mind at a little bit of ease, because I think you'll feel better about your chances if you understood how the NCB goes about scaling the scores. The NCB, the way they scale the scores, the way they score the bar exam is much more fair than the way a typical law exam will be scored. They don't use a curve. It's actually not the correct way to think about it. They use a scale instead. So let's just quickly go over what that means. So the MBE scale, I think of it as like a little bit of a ruler where they're just trying to come up with a score, a scaled score that equates with your raw percentage correct that you got. So typically, let's say 60% will usually more or less scale you in the low 130s. More or less. 65% will be maybe in the high 130s, around 140. 55% will scale in the mid 120s. More or less. Now, I say more or less because each year the NCB changes the scale to match how difficult the questions were. They wait to see how well students did, and then after they see how well the students did on the questions, they make an assessment about how difficult the questions were. And then if the questions ended up being difficult, more difficult than usual, more difficult than in the past, they'll be generous on the scale, and they'll move the scale to the left, so to speak, and so it takes fewer questions right to pass. If, by contrast, the questions end up being a little bit easier than they anticipated, or more easier than in years past, they'll shift the scale over to the right, so to speak, and you'll have to get more questions right to get a scaled passing score. So what they're trying to do every year is come up with questions that are roughly the same difficulty, but that doesn't always work out that way. And so when the questions end up being more difficult than they planned or more difficult than in prior years, they compensate by moving the scale over so it takes fewer questions right to pass. That way, the bar exam shouldn't be any harder or easier to pass in any given year based on how hard the questions end up being. So that's different than your typical law school grade where the professor doesn't really care how hard the questions were. He just does the curve irrespective. Whereas the NCB is trying to make the scale compensate. So let's just real quickly, I'll explain in very simplistic terms how they do that. The bar examiners have a set of questions within the exam called equators. And then they have other questions, and then they have the experimental ones that don't count. So the bar examiners carefully, meticulously select a subset of questions. I don't know how many. They won't tell us, and I'm sure it varies from year to year. But they meticulously pick a set of questions that they have data on because they use the questions over and over again. So they'll pick out a set of questions that have been used in past February iterations, past July, recently, a long time ago, questions they have a lot of confidence in as being fair and representative of the kind of questions they want, and then they pick out this subset of questions. So in my little hypo here, I'm guessing that they may have 75 equators. I have no idea. That's maybe a little high. It might be something more like 50. It could be lower. It probably varies year to year. I'm sure it's not an even number. They probably have like 53 one year, 62 equators the other year. The point is they have a lot of data on these questions, so they know how students have performed on those questions in the past. And they use that as a benchmark by which they can then assess whether the other questions are hard or easy. So let's say, for example, on these equators that they know historically students have gotten 60% of them right in the past. just in general over the years. Then what they do is to see how you did on them. So let's say you got 60% as well. Then that gives them a benchmark by which they can then assess whether the other questions, the other 100, were hard, difficult, or easy. So let's say that you got 60% of the equators right. Okay, very average. Okay, I can dig it. And then you got only 55% of the other questions correct. Well, what does that tell us? You did 5% worse on the other questions than the equators. That tells us that the other questions were hard, right? Because you did 5% worse on them. Or you got 5% fewer correct. So you got 60% equators, which we expect, which is kind of normal, and we understand that. So the only explanation really for why you didn't do as well in the other questions is that they're hard. And we make that assessment. Proof is in the pudding. We make that assessment based on how you did. So if these questions really were hard, then we're going to adjust for that or compensate for that on the scale. So here's the scale, and like I said, typically 60% maybe is like a 131. Well, we're going to move that once we see that these questions were difficult, all these other questions which form the majority of the test, once we see that they're difficult, and we know they're difficult because our equators provide a benchmark that tells us students did not do as well on the other questions, so they must be difficult. We're going to shift that scale to the left. So now, all of a sudden, because of the difficulty of the questions, it doesn't take as many right to scale well. So 60% may typically scale you to like a 131, but if the questions are really hard, 60% will scale all the way up to like a 137 or 138. You know, it takes far fewer correct to pass. So that is how they do it. So if the questions, by contrast, were easier, let's say the students did 60% on the equators, your standard average 60%, and they did better on the other questions, 65%, and they got 5% more right. Well, that tells us the questions were kind of easier. I wouldn't say easy. 65% is still, you're still missing 35%, but easier than years past, or easier than your typical questions from prior years. That's the most logical explanation for why the students did better on these questions than the equators. That subset of questions that we know a lot about already and have data on. So we're going to take our little scale and we're going to shift it the other way. We're going to shift it to the right, make things a little harder. So 60% here is going to scale maybe, although it maybe typically scales to the low 130s if the questions end up being easier based on our benchmark, then a 60% will only scale to like a 128. So how many questions do you have to get right on the MB? Totally depends on how hard the questions are. If the questions are really hard, then you don't have to get nearly as many right. 60% will definitely do it. 60% will get you in the mid to high 130s if the questions are really hard. If the questions are easier than normal, then you're going to have to get maybe in the mid 60s in order to scale up and past the 133 range. So that's how they try to adjust. If the questions are hard, they move that scale to the left. If the questions are easier, they move the scale to the right. And they're just basing that on how the students do on the equators in comparison to how they do on the other questions. So I've heard a lot of, I've seen a lot on Reddit about people who felt the questions were super hard. To be honest with you, I've been doing this about 15 years, and that's kind of par for the course. The questions usually seem harder than they really are, to be honest with you. A lot of students say that they feared it didn't go well, and they ended up doing pretty well, way better than they thought. That's actually kind of normal. But if in fact the questions really were really hard, which maybe they were, then take comfort from the fact that the bar examiners will figure that out, and they'll see it in the numbers, and then they'll adjust the scale and shift it over so you don't have to get as many right in order to make it to compensate so that this year's bar, even if the questions were harder, they're going to try to do everything they can to make sure that it actually wasn't harder to pass. So let's play with hypo just a little bit for a second. Let's say the students did really well in the equators. They did better than normal. Let's say they got 66% right on the equators, 6 percentage points more right on the equators. Well, that tells you it's a smart group. That happens, you know. It varies a little bit from year to year in terms of the proficiency of the students taking the exam. The bar examiners will try to compensate for that as well. Or the way they scale means that you're not punished by being around a group of smarter students. And so when they're trying to figure out whether the questions were hard or easy, which is the key to the scale, it's all relative to how the students did the equators. So let's say the students did 64% on the other questions. That looks pretty good, right? Relatively speaking, you're thinking those questions weren't too hard. They did well. Well, no. The key is they're comparing how they did in the equators with how they did in the other questions. So even though they did 64% on the other questions, that's still 2% lower than how they did on the equators, which tells you that these questions still were hard. The performance is 2% lower. So if the performance on the other questions was lower than the equators, then we know those questions were a little more difficult than what we were expecting or what they did in years past. I'm really simplifying things here. I mean, the way they convert these differences to the scale involves a lot of heavy math that we just don't need to get into. But I just trying to convey the concept. So if the students did slightly worse on the other questions, it's more difficult, so the scale is going to move over to the left. Now, not as far left as our prior hypo, because the drop between how they did in the equators and how they did in the questions is not as steep, so these questions weren't as difficult as the other hypo. So how much they move that ruler over left to right depends on how difficult or easy these questions are. So here, let's say 60% would equal like a 134, because these questions were fairly difficult. In my little group here, our little smart group of smart students who did 6%, got 6% more right on the equators than years past. So these guys are better than your typical group taking the bar exam over the last 25 years. Notice they got 66% equators and 64% of their questions. That gives them, let's say, that's 65% overall, roughly. And with the thing being shifted over a little bit to the left to take into account the difficulty of the questions, that 65% would probably scale to a little over 138, say 139, and that's your mean. So that's a pretty good mean. That's a pretty strong mean that would reflect that the students did well and better than in many years in the past. So that 139 mean on the MBE is a reflection of how well the students did overall in the equators, and also takes into account with the scale how hard the questions were. So that 65% is a pretty strong number, but it's a pretty strong number scaled wise because the questions were hard. Take that same 65%, and let's say a different group of students who got the same exact percentage right, but they just weren't as strong as students, a strong group. They weren't as proficient a group. Because let's say they got 59% on the equators. They did actually a little worse than normal or typical, as students have done in the past. This tells you this group is not as proficient, but they still got 65% right because they just kicked butt on the other questions. 68% right. Well, that tells us what? That tells us those questions were really easier. Right? That's why they got 9% higher on the other questions. So notice they didn't do very well in the equators because they're not really as proficient overall, but they did really well in the other questions because those questions end up being easier. That's the assessment we're deriving from that data. So the scale is going to shift pretty far over to the right because those questions were easy. So now that 65%, although it's the same overall percentage as the last group, it's going to scale not nearly as well. It's going to scale to like a 132. And so the mean is a 132. Even though they got the same exact percentages right, because these questions were easier, that 65 converts to a scale of 132. The prior group, the questions were hard, so it's that same 65 scaled to 139. So there you go. Take-home message here is, right, that I'm trying to convey is that if the questions really were difficult, here you go, questions were really difficult based on the benchmark, that scale's moving to the left, and you won't have to get nearly as many right to pass. If the questions end up being easier, then the scale's moving over to the right in order to compensate for that, and you'll have to get more right. hopefully that kind of conveys the concept, and maybe hopefully provides a little bit of peace of mind. And I'll just say one other thing about how the essays are scaled, because that also, they try and do the same thing for the essays. And so if the essays were hard, they do the same thing where they compensate on the scaling for you. So I've heard a lot of comments on Reddit about how hard the MEs seemed. Well, you know, rest assured that the NCB is going to shift that scale over for the essays to accomplish the same exact thing, and you will not have needed to do nearly as well on the MEs if they were in fact harder to pass. So the way it works real quick for the MEs is, in this one hypo I had here, right, where the proficient group did really well, they got 65% right, and that equated to a 139 mean. What the NCB does is they collect all the raw scores from the states. The essays go out to each individual state, and they give them raw scores on a scale of 1 to 6, right? 6 being, you know, the highest, and either 0 or 1 being the lowest. And so the states don't try to curve anything. They just give it a score based on how well the students did. Now, of course, if the essays are really hard, then the scores are going to be kind of low. If the essays were a little bit easier, the scores might end up being kind of higher, right? But the individual graders at the state level, they just give you a score based on how you did. And so you're going to kind of take it on the chin a little bit in terms of your raw score if the questions were hard, because the graders are just going to give you a grade based on how what they see. So let's say, well, the point is, though, what the NCB will do is they'll get these raw scores from the states, and then they'll scale the essays. And they'll scale it so that the essays will have the same exact mean, and by essays I mean MPTs and MEs, they'll have the same mean as the MBE for your year. So in this hypo, these guys got a 139 mean on the MBE. The NCB will then make that 139 the mean for the essays. So they'll take the raw scores from the states and convert them to the scale so that the mean is identical for the MBE and the essays. So let's say that the average score for the MPTs and the essays was 3.71. You put all six, or all the 2 MPTs and the 6 essays together, boom, 3.71 average mean score. What they'll do, what the NCB will do when they get that data, is they'll take that 3.71, right, that's the average, and they'll scale it to 139. They'll take that ruler and they'll make it so 3.71 equals 139, because they peg the MBE mean, they peg the essay mean to the MBE mean. So 3.71 will equal 139, because 3.71 is the mean for the raw mean, so that'll be converted to a scaled mean of 139, so that matches the MBE mean, which means you really kind of want a high MBE mean. You really want your colleagues to do well on the MBE, because the better the class, the better the class does on the MBE, the higher the average score will be, scale score will be for the essays. Of course, you could look at it the other way. If the students do really well in the MBE, that means they probably did well in the essays, which means it'll be harder to achieve the mean. But either way, it comes out in the wash. So if the students didn't do as well in the MBE, let's see, the mean was 132, then the NCB will peg that average essay score of 3.71 to 132. So 3.71 will equal 132 if that's the mean for the MBE. So take comfort if the MBEs actually were really hard, as a lot of people were saying. If they actually were really difficult, and people take it on the chin at the state level and get really low scores, the NCB will compensate for that. So let's say these essays really were hard, and let's say the average is 3.11, okay? Not 3.7, 3.1, which means people just not do very well. It's okay. It's okay, because at 3.11, the NCB will scale to a 139 if that was the MBE mean. So if the mean essay score was a low 3.1, which is really quite low, but if the MBEs are really hard, that might be the case. That's still going to scale to a nice, healthy passing 139. Right? Because that's the way they tie the MBE mean to the essay mean. So even if you got like a 3.0 average on the essays and the MPTs combined, that could scale to 133 with this nice scale. So, you know, hopefully, so anyway, so that's the take-home message. In this hypo, right, it took a 371 to scale to 139 because that was the average MPT and essay score. But in the prior hypo, it only took a 3.11 to scale to 139 because the essays were harder. And so the mean score was lower. So that's how they compensate. If the multiple choice were hard, and they can tell whether they're hard by comparing how students did with on the equators compared to the questions, then they'll compensate by moving the scale over so you don't have to get nearly as many right to pass. Same thing with the essays. If the essays and the MPTs end up being hard, then the mean score for the essays will be low, but that's okay because whatever the mean is, it will scale to whatever your MBE mean was. Maybe 139 or 138 if you guys did well. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful, and I hope that makes you feel a little better. It's not a curve, right? Because in your typical law school professor's curve, they don't take into account how strong the class is, or they don't cut you slack if the class was strong, like the NCB does in a way, and they don't care whether the questions were hard or easy. They just 15% pass A, 40% B, 20% C. The NCB is not curved like that. I mean, theoretically, everyone could pass. Theoretically, because it's just not curved in that fashion. But what they do is scale so that the difficulty of the questions affects the scale, so that the more difficult they are, the easier it is to pass, so that, as mathematically as we can get it, the bar is the same. It takes the bar exam is ultimately the same difficulty each year, as much as we can achieve that mathematically. And even though the questions some years are harder than others, we compensate that for the scale to try to equalize it out. Okay, hope that was helpful. I can make more of these videos if people actually watch it and find it helpful. All right, peace out.